Next, we're going to be talking about the hormonal regulation of bone growth that utilizes growth hormone, thyroid hormone, testosterone, and estrogen, and they work together to facilitate normal skeletal growth. So, any excesses or deficits in these hormones could cause abnormal skeletal growth. Growth hormone is the most important hormone in stimulating the epiphyseal plate activity, or that activity that increases bone length, especially in infancy and childhood. Thyroid hormone is also known as the major metabolic hormone that modulates activity of growth hormone. So they work together, they have a great synergism. And that's just going to ensure proper proportion of bone growth. And then testosterone in males and estrogen in females that begins to be produced at puberty promote adolescent growth spurts, but also their increased production promotes the end of that growth by inducing epiphyseal plate closure. So we're going to be talking a little bit about these different hormones, but first we have to talk about bone remodeling in more detail. So with bone remodeling, about 5 to 10% of bone mass is recycled each year. So if we add all that up, spongy bone is replaced every 3 to 4 years, and compact bone every 10. And bone remodeling consists of both bone deposit and bone resorption. So it utilizes osteoblasts and osteoclasts respectively. They respond to signals from hormones and stress-sensing osteocytes. And a lot of this occurs at the endosteal surfaces, so inside of bone. So bone resorption is going to be mainly the function of osteoclasts that use their resorption bays to break down matrix. They use lysosomal enzymes and acidic protons to digest the matrix, and these digested products and dissolved minerals are then transported across the osteoclast and released on the opposite side. A lot of those components end up in the blood. Osteoclasts can even phagocytose dead osteocytes and undergo apoptosis when they're no longer needed. So when it comes to bone deposit, we turn actually back to the osteoblasts. Remember, blast cells are building cells, so they can create more unmineralized bone matrix, more osteoid. The area where they create more osteoid is actually known as the osteoid seam. This is just a band of unmineralized bone matrix, so it marks a new area of new matrix. But there's also a calcification front. This is a transition zone between that new osteoid and older mineralized bone. So let's talk about how is that new osteoid eventually calcified. Well, there's proteins in the newly deposited osteoid that will bind calcium ions. They do so through a series of steps that increase calcium ion concentration, which causes osteoblasts to release specialized vesicles that have these chemicals on the outside called alkaline phosphatases. And those phosphatases remove phosphate ions off of the osteoid proteins. And that actually increases the local concentrations of phosphate ions. And then the calcium that's present in the phosphate ions that have accumulated, those ions form crystals. And those crystals are indicative of salts. So these crystals of calcium and phosphate act as the seeds for hydroxyapatite or mineral salt formation. So that results in the calcified bone matrix. But the remodeling continues for your whole life. So it occurs continuously, but it's regulated by two control loops. Hormonal controls that use negative feedback mechanisms in order to control blood calcium levels, and responses to mechanical stress, which are mechanical and gravitational forces, and they're going to act on bone to cause bone remodeling. And that's in order to increase bone strength. So both hormonal controls and response to mechanical stress is what controls bone remodeling. Let's look at the hormonal controls first. Calcium has a lot of functions in the body. It's critical to maintain mitosis. It's needed for neurotransmitter release, but it's also needed to maintain extracellular homeostatic fluid levels. And that includes how much calcium is in the blood. Nerves cannot fire, they can't release their neurotransmitters, muscles won't contract, so we need to make sure that we have plenty of calcium in the blood so it can do what it needs to. But a lot of calcium is stored in bone, so it's a great reservoir of calcium if it's needed. We also need a certain amount of calcium to ensure that our intestines are able to make vitamin D. So there's a lot of different reasons why we might need calcium. Parathyroid hormone is the hormone produced by parathyroid glands, and it's produced in response to low blood calcium levels. Because calcium is so important for many functions, This stimulates osteoclasts to go break down bone, to release calcium from that bone breakdown into the blood, and that raises blood calcium levels. So parathyroid hormone activates osteoclasts, which indirectly ends up giving us more calcium in the blood. And that parathyroid hormone secretion from the parathyroid glands will stop when the homeostatic calcium levels are reached. There's also another hormone in the body called calcitonin, and it's produced by parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, but usually only in response to really high levels of blood calcium. And its effects are mostly negligible, but you can use it in high pharmacological doses to lower blood calcium levels temporarily in someone who is maybe experiencing hypercalcemia. But you can live completely fine if you never have calcitonin. We just want to mention it here as an antagonist to parathyroid hormone, something that does the opposite of parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone increases calcium in the blood, and calcitonin decreases calcium in the blood. So here we see a homeostatic imbalance. Calcium homeostasis is what we're looking at. So if you have falling calcium blood levels, that imbalance triggers the parathyroid glands located on the back of the thyroid gland to release their hormone, parathyroid hormone, which increases blood calcium levels by activating osteoclasts to degrade bone and release some of that calcium in bone back to the blood. So parathyroid hormone is going to be the main hormone that helps dictate and maintain calcium levels in the body. All right, so we've talked about hormonal control of blood calcium, but before we move on, just remember, what is calcium necessary for? Why would we store some in bone and even be able to get some out? Why is it so important that we even break down bone to get this calcium? Well, calcium is necessary for transmission of nerve impulses, neurotransmitter release, muscle contraction, blood coagulation, and even secretion by glands and nerve cells, and cell division or mitosis. So it's used for a lot in the body, which is why the body is more than happy to get it from the bone if needed. Now, there are some chances that even minute changes in blood calcium levels can cause severe neuromuscular problems, such as too much calcium. That's hypercalcemia. High levels of calcium can actually cause non-responsiveness from the nervous system and muscular systems. Hypocalcemia, so low levels of calcium, can actually cause hyperexcitability. So either sustained high or low levels can lead to issues. Sustained high blood calcium levels can also lead to deposits of calcium salts in blood vessels or kidneys, and the formation of stones in kidneys and other organs. So while we want to balance calcium, we want to make sure it's within a dynamic range and doesn't get too low or too high, because it can be detrimental to our nervous and muscular systems and lead to other adverse side effects. So calcitonin, that's produced by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland in response to high levels of blood calcium levels, can sometimes help out with things like hypercalcemia, but it's not going to be kind of overly used. It's not used a lot in the human body. It's not a major hormone of blood calcium control. Our body actually uses other hormones like glucocorticoids and vitamin D to help indirectly stimulate osteoclast activity wherein parathyroid hormone is not present. So calcitonin does exist, but it's not secreted in any large amount in the body. So let's continue on and talk about remodeling. Now we're going to look at its control. When we're not talking about hormones, we're talking about mechanical stress being one of its controls. So bones reflect stresses they encounter. When they're stressed, when they take on kind of more weight or bear more weight than they're used to, when they put stress on muscles that are attached to them, then they're oftentimes going to start remodeling. Wolff's Law states that bones grow or remodel in response to demands placed on them. And since stress is usually off-center, bones tend to bend. They compress to one side. It stretches the other side. And that means that the bone remodeling is going to follow kind of instructions given by those stressors. The diaphysis tends to be the thickest where the bending occurs. And bone is hollow mostly because of that medullary cavity in long bones. But compression and tension cancel out each other at the center of the bones. We don't generally see breaking. So here we're seeing different forces. One side is experiencing compression, the other side tension, based on stressors or load. The load here is being applied at the head of the femur, bending it towards the right side. So we would expect the left side to get thicker or to respond to the mechanical stress the most. So Wolff's Law also explains left and right-handedness, which results in thicker and stronger bone of the corresponding upper limb. Curved bones tend to be the thickest, where they're most likely to buckle, kind of in the center or on the edges. And trabeculae are used in bone because they have curved edges, and that is going to kind of truss up or strengthen areas that are under stress. You'll also learn more about bone naming and looking at large bony projections. You'll note that they occur where heavy active muscles generally attach, and weightlifters have actually enormous thickenings at these muscle attachment sites, especially in their most used muscles. Even before we're born, bones of the fetus or in bedridden people, we see a lack of these structures, or we could say that their bones are featureless because it's the stress on bones that develop these large bony projections or simply these bumps and ridges. So bones as organs and as tissues can atrophy, and that's usually because of lack of use. So deforming bone actually pushes fluid-containing ions through canaliculae, and that creates an electrical current. And osteocytes can detect this electrical current using the gap junctions that connect them to bone and other cells, and that actually promotes the formation of additional bone. So it's still the osteocytes that are monitoring and maintaining the matrix and respond to that mechanical stress. They communicate with osteoblasts and osteoclasts and utilize hormones and their controls in order to determine whether or when and where remodeling needs to occur. So response of bone or the control of remodeling is all down to both hormonal control and responses to mechanical stress. So to summarize control of remodeling, it's mechanical stress and hormones that help determine where remodeling occurs. Next, we're going to be looking at bone repair. So we're going to look at fractures and breaks and kind of the different types of classifications for these fractures. So make sure to watch that next video.